All right. Hey, everybody. I'm going to give a couple of minutes because I know that I just we went live after a few minutes. And so hopefully everybody found us. This is going to be a fun and exciting discussion of that, I'm certain, because there's quite a bit more that I didn't even get into. I felt like I wanted to leave some of the really good, cool stuff to get into for this after class discussion. I think that that's going to be the way I'll do it in the future. I'll kick it off and with a class, and then we'll follow up with a good discussion. Allow you to give your input, your questions, your comments. So welcome everyone. Shabbat Shalom, both to the people who are on our Zoom call and for those who are watching on YouTube. I didn't mean to do because you're welcome as well. See. But I think that we're going to have some fun today. Let me let a couple more people in. All right. So, how many of you thought going into this, a class on the manna? We know everything about the manna. Did anybody learn anything about manna that you didn't know before? And let me ask you this. I wanted to say, how about Seth's little illustration on how much manna it takes to feed the children of Israel? That's pretty powerful. It's almost comical working with Seth. I had a jug that I used to water my plants here at the building, and I was telling Seth that I said, hey, I have this cool idea. People read this text all the time, and they never really think about how much an omer is. And an omer really is a lot when you think about how many omers you're going to need. So I thought the only way I can do that is to show them what an omer looks like. So I was going to put some sand or pebbles, or I didn't know if I could afford that many coriander seed. But I was going to show people kind of to give them an idea. And Seth said, I got this. And so I'm glad he took over and made a much better illustration. So hopefully that brought the point home to everyone who was watching. So what are some of your thoughts and questions and concerns? And because I have more ideas, but I also want to give some of you an opportunity to tell me what you think. And so I'm going to open up the floor for questions. If you're in the room, you want to speak, you simply raise your hand and jump in. If you don't, do it pretty quickly. I'm going to rattle on and on for another little while. Let's see how many. We got people coming in now. Because I want to save a couple of the points that I had until after some of you jump in. How about some, do we have any Christians in the group, or those who are, I guess, attached to the New Testament? Maybe you have some ideas that you'd like to talk about there, the John chapter 6, because I have something to say on that, but I'll just hold it a little bit. All right. Let me tell you this. One thing that I find interesting is that in the New Testament, this is for whatever you want to think about in terms of the New Testament. But a lot of people look for types and shadows. I used to do this when I was a fundamentalist Christian, or when I was in, I guess it wasn't called Hebrew roots then, but that's what it was, or that's what it's evolved into. People look for types and shadows, and I do find it interesting, though I'm not going to give it away this early in our discussion. I do find it interesting that there are only two, according to John's gospel, there are only two things that Jesus in the gospels says, that's me, in the Torah of Moses. There are only two. I'm not going to give those away yet. Let's see if you can guess at least what one of them is, or you may know both of them. Anybody have a guess? Anybody have an idea? Hey, is my mic working? Okay. Just looking to see. All right. So, manna. What is it? What is manna? For a long time, I think whenever I would see the English manna, if you do a search, I covered some of this in the class, but to go over it again, if you do a search for the word manna, Manna, you'll see that it shows up, I think, 17 times in the Hebrew Bible, and none of those have behind the English. If you go to the Hebrew, none of them say manna. So I find that interesting, and I don't think that the scholars are right when they propose that it comes from manhu. It just doesn't make sense to me. That's presented as sort of an etiology, like the word manna comes from manhu, but I think that's sort of a folk etymology. It evolved over time, but the Bible doesn't say this is why we call it manna. I think George Ebers is right, and when I read that, I had not seen that before, but to me it makes more sense. I think a lot of people forget this. If the biblical account tells us, and it does, that the children of Israel, whatever that looked like when they went to Egypt, have been there for 400 plus years, it's a good comparison with what we find in America. I think if some of us, if you do your genealogy, you might be from, I don't know, the Middle East. You might be from one of the African countries. Your people may come, your roots, you could trace your roots back to England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. But those people who can trace it back to a place with a different language, most American families who've been here for 100, 200, 300, 400 years, they don't speak those languages anymore. There may be some preservation of that language. Sometimes the grandfather and the grandmother might talk in the kitchen, but there's a lot of English speaking, so I guess my point would be, when the children of Israel had been in Egypt for that long, it seems more likely that they would not be speaking, calling things after Hebrew names. I'm open for discussion on that, but it just feels to me like referring to food by an Egyptian name. I think that might be the way it went down. Eric, hey, my brother, how are you?
Doing well. Enjoyed it very much. How is can you hear me all right?
Yep, yep, I hear you.
Oh, okay. I was pondering first, my great grandfather, one of them, spoke only German. And I know the next generation did, but my dad just from childhood remembered speaking it and learning it, but really wasn't uh, fluent in speaking. He could read and help people with it, translating and things. But the stories of Goshen and the isolation on the one hand, being ones who ate the gods of Egypt, totally isolated, the electricity stayed, I mean, the lights stayed on and everything else during the plagues.
Yeah,
But then on other accounts, it says they were spread out all over Egypt, working, doing what Joseph wanted them to do. So there's some questions in my mind that how they could have stayed purely Hebrew, especially with the riffraff that came with them.
yeah. Well, there certainly is what we find, and I know that this might be new for some folks, but there is certainly reason to suggest and good evidence to propose that we do have sources, different sources in the Pentateuch and throughout the Hebrew Bible,
Right.
and I think that when you see those sources, it's not anything that hurts my faith. It actually helps it. I mean, in some ways, I can go, okay, well, hang on just a minute. That's why that's in Exodus like
Right.
that, but it's not like that in another book. So,
I just listened to our dear Dr. Tabor's first installment of a new series, and it's those kind of things, along with our use of now I'm gone brain dead on the various sources Bible.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
that's what it's called. It's
yeah,
the Bible with sources revealed by Friedman.
Friedman.
Yeah,
And I found listening to him was extremely interesting. I started his video series teaching that whole lengthy, I don't know how many it is, but listening to him and seeing him made me feel more like, hey, this could be, and of course, what we've been learning with you could be really something more serious. And then seeing how James sorted out just a few verses, if I recall. I haven't printed it out and looked at it yet, but it really makes me see what the Bible should look like.
yeah.
If you get rid of those other voices, stories, traditions, exaggerations, whatever, it's a wonderful thing, and I can see what Yeshua was teaching that's not been embellished by others in the renewed covenant, because it seemed to me that's what he was teaching, what we would have if we didn't have all this added.
I got. Can I tell a quick parable, Karen? I want to call on you, but let me just quickly do this parable. I have this
Please.
story to tell you. There was a farmer, and he went out to sow a field, and he put the seed, and I'm mainly in this story just going to focus on that which fell on the good ground, and it grew. And as it began to grow, don't think you've heard this. This is something I just made up to make this point. And then at night, get this, a bad person comes in, an enemy, and he throws seed like thorns and thistles and weeds all in this nice crop. And they grow up, and the farmer asked a buddy of his, he's like, this is just so frustrating. I have this wonderful crop coming in, and now look, all these weeds, and so they get in a discussion. He said, "You think I ought to like go in and pull all the weeds out and throw them away?" And he said, "I wouldn't do that. Leave them together until the harvest, and then you'll pull the bad out and burn it." And I think that a lot of people, when I started looking at a critical historical approach to the Hebrew Bible, people will often say, "Oh, Ross is just picking and choosing whatever he likes, he keeps whatever he." Well, that's not at all what I'm doing. I've not thrown anything away. I'm allowing the crop to grow. And I think that within that, it is something very important to be able to see. I want to see the different hands. I want to hear the different voices. But what becomes more apparent the longer I study and the more deeply we look at this, you can tell, you can discern the difference between the hands and the voices. You really can. It's obvious. We'll go through examples in a bit after other people get a chance to talk. But that's the way I feel
Yeah,
about it. It's
yeah,
just a little parable.
yeah. It makes sense. And you could walk out in your field and see what's coming up in between and recognize it.
Yep, yep. And
Well, get Miss Karen.
all right. Hey, Karen, how are you? Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Good. Hey, as far as preserving the language thing, in the United States, we have the Amish and, people in Flatbush. English isn't their first language, even after living here for hundreds of years.
Yep.
They'll teach their children, some kind of Pennsylvania Dutch or Yiddish.
That's a good point.
And I think that you're going to see that in insular communities with some kind of religious identity.
Yeah.
They'll tend to have still preserve their original language
Yeah,
for hundreds of years.
that's fair. That's fair. And even in the Jewish community, it's like, well, it's not so much a part of the everyday life, but for instance, you go to a synagogue service, and some of that is done in Hebrew, and some of the Catholic churches use a little bit of Latin, and so there are religious groups. But you also have a major part of the coming of age ceremony, bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah, that where children have to have a tutor because they don't really know the language of their religion, and they have to be trained. So I wonder if, even if it's with this proposal by George Ebers, which is kind of what I was thinking about, it would be very natural, even if, say, the Amish, in your example or other examples, because of what they're familiar with, very possibly they would know these Egyptian words, I would assume, as well, right?
Yeah. I'm sure, because a lot of these languages, they're blends. There's some
Yeah,
kind of lingo or, even in Hawaii, they speak a blended, Native and American language. A lot of the natives do, and I can't understand it.
yeah.
But it's some kind of pidgin, actually.
Pigeon.
Yeah. Um, and then I was gonna say, in Genesis, when Joseph is sitting down to eat with his brothers, there's a mention of the Egyptians not wanting to sit with them.
Yeah,
So there probably was some kind of separation for whatever, I'll say religious or, beliefs,
yeah,
or a belief separation of the time, which, probably would have kept the children of Israel a little more separate from the rest of Egypt.
yeah. Yeah,
So that
people
will
group.
aid in preserving the language.
And we do find that. Those are good points, Karen. We do find that a lot of times people from various ethnic groups or whatever, or they're from a certain place, they have their own culture, they tend to congregate, live together, shop together. They have, so there is some of that, and one wonders how much of an overlap there was. How, I mean, I do find, and we do find this in the Hebrew Bible, particularly among the Levites. We find Egyptian influence. In fact, there are 13 names in the Pentateuch which are Egyptian, and
Hmm.
all 13 are Levites. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And then also I was going to say, Hebrew is it's a Semitic language, and there are lots of nations during this time who are Semitic nations, and they're speaking some kind of Semitic dialect.
yeah,
Even what isn't Aramaic taken from a blend of Akkadian and something else?
mm,
And that's even older than the children of Israel. I mean, that's like before Abraham.
mm,
So, there were lots of people speaking Semitic dialects.
yeah,
I don't, Egyptian is not a Semitic dialect, and like Sumerian is not a Semitic dialect, but yeah, Akkadian is, and I want to say, I mean, there's a number, quite a
yeah,
few in that area, in the Fertile Crescent or Phoenicia or that. I mean, the Canaanites, they spoke a type of, I guess you could say a type of Hebrew if you want to call it that, but it,
right.
it was a Semitic dialect as well. And I think a lot of Hebrew words are also Canaanite words.
Yeah, and there's people talk about sort of a proto-Semitic language. What was
Yeah.
that? What was that earliest form, if you dropped into the land of Canaan in 3600 BCE, and you heard people talking, how, and then what would it sound like? And then would you recognize any words if you know a little bit of Hebrew? And I think you would. But in addition to that, how much could a Hittite understand of these other groups and so forth? So, and we're learning more based on discoveries. Some of that is becoming more and more clear. Like you mentioned Akkadian. Some of the Akkadian cuneiform inscriptions, if you could read cuneiform, which I can't yet, but I've seen it transliterated, and I know what it's saying, to some degree, because there's quite a bit there that is it's what, like you said, it's not really Hebrew, but Hebrew has those same words and that same vocabulary. So good stuff.
I found something the other day you might find interesting.
All right.
Well, I'm doing I like to do little research projects. I'm trying to find the real Kadesh Barnea.
Oh, good.
Harder than you'd think.
Yeah.
So, I was searching, cuneiform, how many cuneiform tablets have been found in the land of Israel, and not very many actually. But they did, and the only out of all of the ones they found, they've only found one Hebrew name on all the tablets. And can you guess what it is?
No, what is it?
It's Netanyahu.
Well,
Isn't that weird?
that is weird.
Little fun fact there for you.
I like that. I bet you he likes that too.
Probably.
That is amazing. That's some fun stuff.
Right?
Cuneiform. What else, Karen?
That's it. When you do your talk on Kadesh Barnea, I'm trying to get ready for that one. Oh, and one more question.
Yep.
Are you of the assumption that Har Karkum is Mount Sinai?
I tell you,
The leading contender for
I think it is in the small window of selections for me, that area, because it's the area that makes more sense. When I read the text, and one of the things that I have not yet done but I intend to do, there is a woman scholar, Deborah Hearn, who just received her PhD, and this is not what her PhD is in, but her PhD really is in this, if that makes sense. She studied for about 20 some odd years the wilderness itineraries, based on the text, and she used geographic clues. She talks about water tables and ancient trails, and she wrote a couple of 100 pages for a PhD dissertation. And she believes that Har Karkom is the biblical Mount Sinai. Now, I was introduced to the subject, the Tylers and I really got into it a couple of years ago, reading Anati's book, Professor Anati. He's still alive. He's in his 90s, but back in the 50s, he was responsible for a survey of the Sinai region when Israel controlled it, and he found he found Har Karkum as part of that survey, and only later did it hit him, hey, this is a candidate for Horeb. So I read his works. There are problems with the view, just as there are with every view, but I'm obviously, and I know people have heard me say, I'm not one who thinks the traditional Mount Sinai at St. Catherine's, I don't believe that's it. I think it's too far south. I think that if you look at the one in Saudi, I think it's way too far east. Remember, in Exodus 16, we're a month in. We've already moved upwards maybe of 3 million people a month into the wilderness, and that's where we are. We're almost at Sinai. And I don't think you could get them all the way to, anyway, won't go into that. But yes, so I do, long way to answer, yes, it is one of the candidates, and there are a couple of others that aren't far from that area, but it's called the T Plateau, TIH. and there are a lot of water basins, and because that's what you have to have. Even though the wilderness journey in the scriptures, they go without water at times, but it seems to me that it makes more sense that they would follow a route. Remember, Aaron knows exactly where it is. Moses is able to send his wife and kids away. He's like, okay, honey, I'm busy working, doing my stuff. You guys go back to your daddy. And she's like, I can imagine. She's like, you're going to send me all the way to Saudi Arabia with these two kids screaming the whole way? Typical man. I can just imagine that wouldn't be very good. So anyway, yes, I do think it is. And again, the biggest point that people have pointed out that says it can't be is that Khartoum, which is a modern name, by the way, does have a lot of the signs that you would expect to see if you're looking for Sinai or Horeb, but it's late. It's early. So, for instance, by the early Bronze Age, after the early Bronze Age, you have a large gap of time where there's no activity there. So some people say you're late for a very important date if you're on that one. So good stuff, though.
Anywho, maybe they continued to use it. Anywho,
Yep.
I'm just saying my daughters are in here listening today.
Well, look, make sure. Hey, how's it going, girls? Hello. Good to see. I know all of them from Facebook. You guys have a lot of fun. That's right. I will say, though, that one of the things that we have, that Jonah and I have planned, is a group trip to Har Khartoum, and that's coming up. We hope, God willing, that things get better and we can do our Egypt, Jordan, Israel tour, maybe even as early as the spring of 2025. We're watching. As you know, it's hard to predict.
Right.
So
sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Karen.
Okay.
Bye, girls. Hey, Todd and Angel. How are you?
Good. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Kind of going on the same preface as what Karen was talking about as far as like the languages.
Uh-huh.
I got a little different spin on it, but I can remember back at our last church that we were at, we would have conversations with the pastor, because there was a lot of times that we were with him just by ourselves. This was during the COVID thing, whatever. And I was explaining to him that we were trying to find a lot of old translations in Hebrew, just to kind of figure out what they really said, how close to translations we have and everything. And his argument was, that doesn't matter. All we have is the Greek, and that's what really matters. I'm kind of like, yeah, but that's not what it was originally written in.
Yeah.
And he says, well, they can't prove any of that. I was like, okay, so apparently the Old Testament, the Tanakh and everything, the Torah, was written in Greek. He's like, well, that's all that matters. I was like, okay.
Well, we do have, as you know, we do have people who are very fundamental in their approach. Look, watch this. I was among them.
Yeah.
And I think that the more that we study and entertain these things, I mean, we're exposed to some wonderful tools to use in our investigation. So what I really appreciate in textual studies, which sounds like what you were introducing to this person, if I want to look at the Greek, I want to look at the Hebrew, I want to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, I want to look at every source that's available, because I'm trying to make a good decision, and there is a decision-making process that plays in. It's not just, I know I get accused of a lot of things. I mean, I'm used to it. It's okay. I don't lose any sleep over it. But I get accused of picking and choosing. But what I really want to do is I want to analyze the text like you do, and I want to say, okay, what are some of our early sources? Is this earlier? I remember as a young person reading my King James Bible, even, and a good study Bible at that, and I would find a note that said, this verse is missing in the oldest manuscripts. And I would go, yeah. What in the world did I just read? I mean, that's troubling to people. And I get that. I mean, so I know that you're a patient person just from my encounters with you, but but that's where they're at. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's scary, man. It's scary as all get out.
Especially with translations we have now that they intentionally just leave out verses.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about the newer stuff.
Yeah.
And that's, I got no words for that.
Well,
I don't understand why they do it, but
yeah, again, it's one of the things that pleases me so much with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I guess I've kind of been a rebel my whole life, even when I didn't admit it. But I like the idea of, you mean to tell me we have texts that were in a cave and nobody had them? There was no monkeying around with them. And yeah, I'd like to read those. So I think that's kind of, now I will say, I don't necessarily say that the oldest text is the best text always, but I kind of want to think that. I mean,
yeah.
what we know from the Masoretic text is that over time, the Masoretes, who were brilliant scholars and wonderful at what they did, but they opted for, here is the text that I want, you know, and all other texts would eventually be pushed aside. So now,
Yeah, 'cause I'm always trying to find like the oldest version of something on PDF that I can download.
Yeah,
And just look at it, compare it to, you know, stuff that we already have, and see what similarities or even artificial stuff is in there.
yeah,
But one thing I think is interesting, talking about the old languages, you know, if you read, say the Torah especially, you read it in the old Paleo with the old pictographs. You know, each letter has a meaning. It has a visual meaning of what that is. Like sheen is teeth, crushing. You know, mem is water. You know, things like that. You put the words together and it actually will spell out exactly what you're reading, which I think is fascinating. And it's, again, that's just something that if you bring up to somebody, they just look at you like you're an idiot half the time.
yeah.
That's a real shame. It really is, because you learn more like that. You learn more when you read into it like that.
Yeah, I think there is a depth. There's quite a bit that we've not yet connected. We've not yet understood in terms of the real meaning behind words. And is it Jeff Brenner? I think is the guy. Maybe you're familiar with his stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And what we see is that he puts. I know he's not the only one that talks about what you just mentioned, Todd. But that each word in Paleo, you know, but let me just say, for what it's worth, my view is that there's been a lot made of that, and while I think there is an element that we need to discern there, I think that it becomes sort of iffy, if I can say it that way, iffy when people start, you know, they build theological points into words that probably weren't really there to begin with. Now, I think it's fascinating, but also, and I've talked about this in the past, like many of you, I read Drosnin's books, The Bible Code, at a certain point in my life, and man, I'm telling you, I was pumped up over that. And yet at this point in my walk, I would say, you know, it's fascinating. It truly is, but it's not something that you know, that I would really latch on to in terms of my faith. But
I was like it too. I found it really fascinating, but I just wasn't drawn to it to hang on to everything he was talking about. But I did find it fascinating, but
yeah,
it's just not something I'm going to, like, you know, hold as important to learn.
Right. Now, do you study? I know you study languages. Do you know Greek as well?
No.
Okay. Okay.
We're still trying to figure out how to read Hebrew. I mean,
Okay.
we can do little things here and there, but
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not like you that can turn on the other page and just go, okay, and here's what it says right here. Although I do love the kind of redneck tone you put to it, though. That's actually kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It's as one of my Hebrew friends said. James and I were visiting, and he said that I spoke like John Wayne reading the Hebrew Bible. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but hey, thanks, Todd. It's good to see you guys.
You too.
James Brumgard, Shabbat
Hello,
Shalom.
Ross.
Hey, James.
I loved your class today. A couple things have come up to comment on. The first, I'm going to comment stories that I've read. I believe it was the carrier pigeon that used to be very highly populated in the eastern United States. And they would migrate in these mammoth flocks in the fall. And to the point where, people would gather buckets and buckets or bushels and bushels of them. They would just shoot into the trees with their shotguns, and they have all this, make pigeon pie or whatever out of it. But it was just, there are experiences like that where the flocks of birds were just much more huge than anything that we see today.
Yeah.
I am on my job when I worked probably about 25 years ago. I met a man who lived in Western Pennsylvania, and he talked about seeing a flock of starlings beginning to come in and roost for the evening. He was at a job site. He was a contractor, and he was just checking up on the day's work when these birds started to arrive. And it was like this large cloud just descended upon everything around him, the trees and the meadow and all that. There were so many birds landing in the trees that the branches would break off and fall.
Yeah.
And the birds would all squawk and fly, try to reposition themselves. And I can only, in my mind's eye, see how the quail coming in would have looked something like that, where it's just an unending stream of wildlife flying through the air and landing.
Yeah.
And they say quail. I don't know if there were flocks of quail or pigeons or whatever that might have been. So that's one comment that I've had a chance to meet someone that's seen something like that.
Yeah.
The other part is this idea of the language that you speak at home. I made a comment earlier in the chat on this call about my grandfather not learning English until he was 8 years old. He grew up in a German-speaking household, and he would have been second generation born in the U.S. His great-grandfather came over about 50 years before he was born, and that was the tongue in the house, was German.
Yeah.
In fact, during World War II, there was a German POW camp in Pennsylvania. That's where I'm originally from, and this camp was probably about 35, 40 miles southwest of Harrisburg, if people understand Pennsylvania geography. Anyway, he lived about 25 or 30 miles from that camp, and he was asked on occasion to go up and help translate with the prisoners. Now, the dialect of German that he spoke wasn't the same that they spoke, but
they could get along.
It was enough that he could understand them and help let the guards know what in the world they were talking about. So
yeah.
So
good stuff.
The idea of if the people coming out of Egypt, they still knew Egyptian words, so that makes sense that they would be absorbed into the way they spoke. So
yeah, no, it's a good point, and I appreciate both of those points. So the first one is that you think that based on the story that there could be a big migration. And other people have proposed the same. So I want to say that is one of the theories, that's what we're reading about in the book of Numbers. But just one of the things I wanted to bring up is that I think, and I know some people, let me see how to word this nicely so I don't get a bunch of digital tomatoes thrown at me. But I think that at times the biblical writers will exaggerate some of the numbers, and so, for instance, it's one thing to say, man, I bet you it was a big flock of, it was so, you wouldn't believe it, Ross. Well, how do I say that in words to make me understand? Well, one way to do it is to say, let me tell you, imagine the camp of Israel, And if you get on the outside of one side of the camp and you go for a day's journey, and you get on the other side and you go for a day's journey, both of those directions, 3 feet high, there were quail. And I would say, what? 3 feet high? 3 feet high? So you see, now, could it have been massive number of quail? Maybe. But I just find that to be, maybe the pen is just trying to make a point. Look, there was so many. It's a lot. Anyway, good stuff. David, Tyler, and Patty, I presume, and maybe Steve. I don't know. Maybe Steve's with. Steve with you? Is Karen Dupree? Who all's with you, Dave?
It's Patty and I right now.
Okay. Hey guys.
Hey. So
hey, I like that background. What is that background?
So that is where on Har Karkum they think the tabernacle was set up.
Oh yeah.
And it's quite there's a lot of Anadi's got a lot of data. So well, anyways, that's another whole subject. Couple things I wanted to say. I work with Dr. Tabor on the Talpiot tomb, and one of the issues was that there's
everyone.
There's Patty.
Hey, Patty.
Hi.
There was I'm sitting outside today. It's beautiful. There was something that really hit me, which I didn't know till I started looking at it. But you can download accurate estimates of the population of Jerusalem at the time.
Yeah.
This really puts and I don't want to get into this discussion, but I think James found the tomb of Jesus for sure. The family, and the point is when you all of a sudden shrink the population, those numbers really go out of range. So if the odds of finding all these people in the Talpiot tomb were 1 in a billion, and there's 6 million people, that's one thing. But if there's 250,000 people at the time of Jesus, that becomes one just almost impossible to not be their tomb, or So
Yeah.
I don't want to go into that, but certainly I took that same approach because I've been studying the Northern Exodus route like you, with Deborah Hearn and you and James, and a lot of people have thrown in a lot of good ideas that there's no way they went across the sea to I mean just the route to go to Saudi Arabia for Mount Sinai is just insanely, in my opinion. But I look at the amount of people that were in Egypt at that time, and I can just say clearly that there was not 3 million people that left Egypt, in my opinion. I don't want people getting upset. It's just that it was a much smaller group of people that left. I believe that happened, but the issue for me is quite simply that they do exaggerate the numbers because all old myths do. And I put up, another thing that Dr. Tabor brought up a long time ago. I put up the definition of it is euhemerism, and that is there is still truth in these stories. And the last point I want to make here is that the fact that we have different stories is a good thing, because it's out of that we can abstract the truth of what we can know. So I don't think that one story is all correct. And even today, if you took all the social media about, say, the politics in America and put it into a time capsule and went 1,000 years ahead, if the world is still here in that time, you would find out that that some people had part of the truth, other people another part of the truth, and try to get the real view of what happens. You can't just listen to one source, especially with news today. I remember when I grew up, there were 3 news channels, and you got pretty much the same story. There wasn't the spin in it. But mostly they told the truth. So that's what I wanted to say. I'm grateful that we have the so-called, Tanakh as we do, and we have Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have other people writing things. And so I think when you put all that together, you can discern some simple truths. And one of them to me is 100% the 10 words.
Yeah.
And that's really what I focus on in my life. I think a lot of it was added to for, you talked about the anachronisms today. How could they have known about the tablets if they haven't been given them yet? I
Right.
don't even, if the tablets were written on, I don't even think Moses knew that was going to happen until he got them. And then he's like, oh no, look what we got,
Yeah.
and so I think you have to look at it with an open mind and try to get out the most important elements, and the 10 are the most important elements. And there's a lot of other good laws that come out of this. And maybe they weren't given by God. Maybe the Levites put in, don't have sex with your mother or your aunts or your close cousins. Maybe that's a good rule from a genetic point of view, but maybe that's something they added that I still agree with,
Yeah.
and so my point in the end is just that I look at all of it and try to absorb what are the basic truths. Then there's another level of these are good things, and then there's a level of that's just
Yeah.
that's just BS.
Yeah.
Some of it, how do you find if your wife is cheating and that kind of stuff? I don't believe God ever said that, personally. Anyways, it was a great talk today, and it was clickbait because I saw that big challah, and I wanted
Yeah.
the store was out of challah yesterday. I wanted to eat that, and then I find out that's not what we're talking about. So,
Well, it's funny. One thing. I'll thank you, David. One thing, and by the way, that's a cool picture. Every time I've been to Har Kharkoum, it's been with Dave and Patty, and we had others, Ron Vanderham and Jono Vandor and Vicky, and a few others have been with Elon. But it's a fascinating study, and we encourage you to look at that. One thing I was going to say. When we talk about numbers as a theoretical mathematician, you'll know much more of this than me. I hate math, always have hated math, and have never been good at it. So, but I just wanted something simple to show people that the Bible at times uses language which may not be it may not be exactly true in terms of the numbers. Now, I know people might get nervous when I say that, but for instance, there is a theory. Now, Richard Elliott Friedman, by the way, says don't do this because it doesn't hold up. You've heard this about Aleph can mean 1,000, but it can also mean a clan. And so one idea, and I kind of like this, even though he says don't do this, is that is a possibility. That instead of 603,550,000 men, maybe it's families, 603,000, whatever. So, I mean, 603 families or whatever. But his point is, he said, it's someone who wants to accept the face value of what the text says, but wants it to be more reasonable. Well, the reason I did, the reason I had asked Seth to help me, and he knocked it out of the park on the illustration with the manna, was because the manna, even if you say, don't do the 3 million, but you just look at it's this much per person per day. Now, however many, it's not just like you walk by and get bug spit off the leaf of a desert plant, you see. It's bigger than that. And then if you go with the biblical numbers, it's off the chart. But anyway, but I think you're right. If we can still have these good textual questions, is that what it's talking about? So we'll be talking more on some of these numbers, though, David. I appreciate your insight on that, and all of our good trips to Khartoum. We need to go back.
Yeah, they didn't allow us to go. We tried going this last trip, and they're like, dude.
Yeah. I bet.
Yeah.
You have to get military escort. Good deal.
Do. Thank you.
All right, David, hang around. We might bring you back up for math questions. Tom, how are you, brother? Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom for us. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I just want to say at first that I wouldn't argue that against the idea that this text in Exodus 16 was written after the event.
Okay.
the question becomes who wrote it, right? Because the Torah itself, right, when we say the first 5 books was written, it's tradition that it was written by Moses, but the Torah itself does not say that, right? I think we'd agree on that.
Well, just
there are some things it says that Moses wrote, right?
One caveat, if I may, and I don't want to interrupt you because I'm wanting to hear what you say, but it does say Moses wrote the Torah. Deuteronomy 31:9, Deuteronomy 31:22, Deuteronomy 31:24 through 26. But the question is, what is the Torah? And I say it's not the whole Pentateuch. Sorry, I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah. The Torah means instruction, right?
Yeah.
So what particular instructions, right? Okay, so the question becomes who wrote this, right? Who's the narrator? That's my question. I've often wondered if the narrator could have been the one who met with Joshua in chapter 5, or maybe is he the same one who met with Gideon, the same one who met with Manoah? I wonder. Palah, as you mentioned last week. But to say that these are 2 different accounts, I would argue, and let me make an argument. I know you're saying that it's the same account. I would argue that they're 2 different accounts, because we're dealing with the people that were just taken out of Egypt, people beaten down, people who, when Moshe went to Pharaoh, they were told to gather straw yourself, gather your own straw. So they were fighting amongst themselves to gather straw and hoarding it, I would imagine. So they pit the people against each other. And now they come out of Egypt, and they're on their way to the Mount Sinai, Horeb, however you want to. And they're complaining. They want food. What do? You're bringing us out here. We're going to die out here. And even after it goes to the human nature. How many times do we make the same mistakes over and over again? How many times, that's what I think the Torah is expressing, is how quickly we forget. I don't know about you, but I do. So here we got this broken people, and they were fighting over straw, and now they need food, and Jehovah tells them, it doesn't matter how much you gather, you're all going to get enough. Right, and this is a test before they even receive it. If you notice, it specifically says that he's using this. He's going to test them, and he's going to give them. And he's dealing with this broken people, and he's going to bring them to Mount Sinai and give them the covenant. And he wants to see, are they going to be able to walk in his way? And he's training them. That's what I see. And not only that, on the Sabbath you're going to get double. And it doesn't, like I say, it doesn't matter how much you get, you're all going to end up with what you need. And that's a completely different experience than they had in Egypt. Here they are, they're complaining, oh, this God, we might as well have died in Egypt. You're going to bring us out here to die in the wilderness. This God's a tyrant just as bad as Pharaoh. Well, no, he's not.
Yeah.
So then only 1 year later, they're in the wilderness, and now, if you notice in the Numbers account, it specifically points out that now they're not just complaining about the food, now they're complaining about the manna too. Oh, we don't like the manna either. We're tired of this manna, right? That's what it says in the Numbers account. And that's when Jehovah gets, now Jehovah is a whole different, now, really? Okay, you guys, okay, I'm going to give you so much flesh that's going to come out your nostrils. He's getting fed up with them. It's a different story. And then you get to chapter 21 of Numbers, right? And they actually say this detestable, this abhorrent manna, they're calling it, right? So to say that this is just one account and that it's different writers, I think takes away from this finely woven fabric. It's showing the nature of man at the same time, and how quickly we forget. How many times, like one of the things I've been recognizing more and more lately for some reason is Yehuda means to thank, right? Yehuda means it comes from the word to thank, right? And how many times do we pray to God. Oh, please do this, please help heal my friend for this. And then it comes and it happens, and we forget to thank him. We just move on. Oh, and we forget. We have built-in forgetters.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what the text is expressing. I see Abraham and Isaac making the same mistakes, and Jacob. That's part of the point of the Torah, the instruction. No. Anyway, that's
good points.
I can
Good
bring up more
observation.
details. I can bring up more details
Yeah.
if you want.
Oh yeah, I could too. Yeah, I think the trick is when we look at this, but I do appreciate your input and trust that you've looked at these things very deeply as I have and will continue. The text, what we have to realize is that if you look at it, Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, is out of order. We've talked about that. We can clearly see that they're clearly, because we have dates. In fact, Numbers chapter 9 tells us where we're at. We're only in the second year. It's about the same time as this other text. So anyway, but we'll talk more about that later. We'll get some more comments and questions going. It's what I want to do, and I think what you want to do is stick with the text. I don't want to put things in the text that aren't there. So I want to be very careful, and I know you do as well. So I appreciate your comments. Hang tight. We'll probably get more into it.
Jesse, just one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
About the narrator, about the possible narrator. The Bible code, I got that Bible code book too. I got a lot of books too.
Oh, yeah.
I don't read them all, but
yeah.
I don't believe in the codes. I think that's a little spurious, but I do believe there are things hidden in the texts. And one of the clues for a possible narrator, from my perspective, is in page 101, at the end of page 100, the beginning of page 101. So with that, I'll drop my thing here.
All right, I'm going to write that down. That's in Drosnin's book, and I'll look at it.
Okie doke.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. Dr. James Tabor, how are you? Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Good afternoon.
Hey, how you doing, Russ?
Good.
And everybody. Okay, I just had a few things. I just put an article up on the Bible codes that I wrote years ago. It's not formatted properly anymore, but it's a PDF. If you scroll back in the chat, you can download that and read it. It's pretty comprehensive and sort of goes through that. Secondly, Aleph, what Ross was saying of Richard Elliott Friedman, let me give you my take on what he's trying to say, because I agree with him. I think Ross does too. There's no doubt that the Hebrew word Aleph can mean clan or family. For example, in Judges 6, verse 15, we've got angel of the Lord appearing and so forth in Gideon. It's a Gideon story. And he says, behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, my Aleph, my clan. So it doesn't have to be the number. However, what Friedman's saying, when you're reading the account in Numbers, you're adding people up. You're coming up with a number.
Yeah.
And when you get your total, you say, oh, it's 613 Elephs. So it's really 600 clans, 600,000. But the details of each tribe are actually numbered, as individuals. So I think what he's saying is, don't make that text say that. Don't make that text mean clan, because it clearly doesn't mean clan. Just let it mean what it wants. But keep in mind that the tradition underlying that text could well be an understanding of how many clans were there. So the people who favor this, like James Hoffmeyer is one who's argued this, a very good scholar on the Exodus. I think that's really their point. Not that you can read Numbers. And was it Karen or who was working on the numbers, I think, of the tribes and where they camp and so forth. that's pretty well laid out. I mean, it's hard to go through and every time you have the word Elif say, well, that actually just means a clan, because that's obviously not what it means in that context.
Right.
But it doesn't negate the possibility that we're talking about 600 clans, not 600,000 people in the original tradition. Okay.
Right.
If you can go with that. But that's just a side point. The main point, if you'll let me share my screen,
All
I
right.
want to just go back to the man. You know, we're never going to solve the problem of man and manna because I want to just say man all the time. Manhu,
Yeah.
you know, what's this? What's this?
You should be good now, James. See if you can.
Okay. But so we're there. But one interesting thing, this is on my blog.
Yep.
You can see, I don't know if you can see the address at the top, but it's easy to find because if you just put in bugs, you'll get it on the search right here. Because I don't write a lot about bugs.
Yeah.
Ross talks about bugs all day today, but or beans or pancakes. I almost never write articles on bugs, beans, or pancakes. But you might find this interesting if you're not aware of it. So it goes through the different discussions about the diet of the baptizer,
Yeah.
Yochanan Hamatfiel, John the Dipper, literally. Okay. It seems to be an ascetic lifestyle with an austerity of dress and diet. So is it locusts? But if you go on down here, and I'll make this a little bigger for you where you can see it, it's just an interesting point. We do have a text called the Gospel of the Ebionites.
Right.
Okay. And it's only in fragments and it's preserved by people who hate them. They detest the Ebionites. And the Ebionites are a group that we know mostly from enemies. Epiphanius, right here, he really hates them and writes, you can see there's quite a bit. But in this one section of what he calls the Panarion, the breadbasket, he quotes a little quote of the Gospel of Ebionites, and he says in their text, they have it's some version of Matthew, we think, Hebrew Matthew. They have an interesting thing, where they say it's not actually locus. I put the Greek here, but in English it's akris with a K, the word locus. That's Greek, like our Greek New Testament. But there's a very similar Greek word for honey cake, increase or increase. It's
Yep.
pronounced actually in Greek today, ekris. So you can see it's one letter difference. And if I say it, akris, ekris, like that.
Yep.
What did I say? Did I say bugs, locusts, or did I say honey cake? So it's an interesting possibility. And then we also have in Josephus, not the Greek Josephus that you have, but if you do have, because most people have
Whiston. Whiston.
Whiston, yeah. I was going to say Thackeray. But if you have Thackeray, which is the Loeb classic with the Greek text, in the back of the last, I think it's of the Wars, there is a Slavonic Josephus. It's preserved in Slavonic, which is an old form of Russian or Slavic language, Cyrillic alphabet. And in Slavonic Josephus, it says a similar thing. So that would be a parallel that Josephus says he originally wrote in Aramaic or Hebrew and then had it translated into Greek. His Greek is really hard, by the way. When I did my PhD exams, I was terrified that they were going to pull out a Loeb classic of Josephus and because they just hit you live in the test. You're sitting around with these professors that are all fluent and they go, here, Mr. Not doctor yet, Mr. Tabor, here, read Wars 2 lines 8 through 15 for us. Read it in Greek and translate it. And you're like, whoa, it's tough Greek. Okay. I couldn't have done it in Aramaic either. But anyway, Slavonic might be the more original version of Josephus, but it's got a lot of stuff added. And one of the things it has is a new comment on diet, and it doesn't have locusts at all. Of alternative tradition circulating. Because remember, the Ebionites don't eat flesh of any type,
Yeah.
including locusts. They don't believe in, they're vegetarian, probably vegan. I don't know if they're vegan, but they're vegetarian. And so in that Slavonic Josephus, it says that he ate roots and excretions of plants that grow of themselves. And the idea, we call it unprocessed food today. Like you said, I'm not going to eat anything but just food from my garden or from someone else's garden if you don't grow enough. But I'm not going to process it. I'm not going to have 25 chemicals in it. I'm not going to have hormone, just the food as it grows right out of the soil. That's what I want. That's what it sounds like. And we also get that idea in other texts of the scrolls that maybe going back to the desert way is to sort of live off of what's produced by God himself. So the locust thing there are two other traditions that it might be something closer to the manna. Now, that doesn't tell you what the manna is, of course, but it would say that there's a tradition that John is maybe trying to live like they lived in the wilderness, that kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've also wondered, because of Greek, when in the temptation story, which is preserved only in the Q source, Matthew and Luke, it's not, Mark just says the Satan drove him into the wilderness and he was tempted, but it doesn't give the temptations. Commanding the bread to become stones, I'm sorry, the stones to become bread the other way. Either way would be a miracle, right? But I'm thinking of the Abraham. Commanding the stones to become bread, since he is in the wilderness, Jesus, and I think he's at Horeb. We talked about that last week. It doesn't say the wilderness of Judea. It just makes sense that he's doing the Elijah thing. So let's say he's at Horeb. I'm talking about Jesus of Nazareth travels down to Khartoum. We'll go with Tyler's identification. Well, you've traveled to Khartoum 2 or 3 times. It's in a Jeep, but it can be done. Elijah traveled there, if that's the location. I'm just using that as an example. And what if the temptation is, oh, you're like Moses, you're the guy, you're the son of God, you're whatever. Make some manna for me.
Yeah.
Make some manna for me. That's how I take it. It could be loaves of bread. Who knows? It's the word bread, artos. But it actually, artos in Greek, it's almost like we say, give us this day our daily bread.
Yeah.
Does it just mean bread? I have carrots in my garden. Oh, I'm not going to ask for those. Yes, I will. So, and we say that today, of course, our daily bread. So it's a new thought if you haven't thought of that. And once I heard it years ago, I don't know who told me that. I think it was Roy Bliven or one of those Hebrew gospel guys in the Jerusalem school. I just thought, dang, that sounds right to me. I think it's manna.
Yeah.
Okay, turn these rocks into manna. I don't, maybe the tempter's saying, I don't even know what manna is, but I'd like to see some. It's been, 3,000 years since we've had any manna, or 2,500. However, back to the text, as Ross said, this is the same point as Elif. When I start reading that it looks like frost on the ground and it's a white coating and it rots in the sun, it sounds more like, it just doesn't sound like a honey cake that's on a desert plant that John the Baptist might have eaten. Or all these other proposals like, oh, it was carob beans. That's another possibility that John the Baptist ate carob beans,
Yeah.
because there is a correspondence to the word locust and carob, because carobs look like grasshoppers hanging. You've seen carobs, some of you, right? They're kind of like a funny green bean hanging down. Um, so I kind of go with what Ross said throughout today, that we don't know what it is, but it is it is something that you can gather and grind and boil and so forth. And none of these proposals, as brilliant as they are, it's sort of like Paul's thorn in the flesh. You go over all the someone said it's this and it's this plan and it's bug, what did you call it? Bug spit or secretions
Yeah.
or whatever. Something that oozes out of some plant. It still doesn't fit the text. Just like Aleph, it still doesn't fit. The text sounds like it's just this stuff that appears every morning on the ground, and you got to go out and gather it, at sunrise before it gets too hot. You're in the desert. Well, there's nothing that appears on the ground in the desert that you could scoop up and put in a jar, right? That I've ever heard of. So all these proposals don't fit the text. So remember the name, Mahu.
Yeah.
What is he? What is this? And I love calling it that. So what do you think what is this is? It's what is this?
Yeah.
So that's the comment.
Hey, one point as a
Sure.
follow-up on at least Luke 4. I was just looking and if we look at Luke 4:3, the adversary, the devil, said to him, "If you're the Son of God, command the stone to become a loaf of bread." And then, as you pointed out, Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 8:3, which chapter 8, verse 3 and 8, verse 16, it's specifically talking about manna. What also is interesting, and we've
Yes,
talked about this
absolutely,
before, he only quotes from, when he's talking from the Pentateuch, he's only quoting from what we now know as Deuteronomy.
Right.
And there's
right.
at least one list that we talked about a couple of weeks ago for this ancient triennial cycle of readings that you could even, if not only is Jesus here quoting from the Pentateuch, but he seems to be possibly associated with a time of year, because Isaiah 61, at least according to Rabbi Mann, who put that triennial chart together, it puts you at Deuteronomy and Isaiah 61. So anyway, it's
And
just an
since his
interesting.
name is Rabbi Man,
Yeah, mine. That's right.
then it has to be right.
That's right.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, James.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, Todd and Angel, welcome back.
Hey, one quick thing that James had just brought up, that forgive me for not remembering where I researched this. It's been a few years ago, but several, I guess, writings or whatever that we have run across over the years is the John eating locusts was actually a mistranslation. He ate from locust trees. But throughout the years of translation, the trees was left out. So if he ate from locust tree, that would make more sense. It just kind of makes me wonder if they left out the trees and just said he ate locusts to make him look a little,
Yeah.
to put it lightly. Because growing up in church, I always heard that John was a kind of a crazy person who was preaching in the forest to everybody, or whatever. But yeah, the whole eating locusts, I'm not sure I buy that. But like I said, and again, forgive me for not remembering. This just kind of happened, but it just popped in my head. I was like, well, I remember reading it was he ate from the locust tree. So I don't know if you've ever run across
That's
that.
probably the idea of the carob, Todd.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe
I think
that's
that's
what I was
right.
thinking. Yeah.
Okay.
Carob, you've had carob, right? It's
Yeah.
It's sort of the desert chocolate.
I love it.
Yeah, we have it here.
Yeah.
Right. So
Well,
Okay.
one thing I remember when I first, years ago, I was young, and I remember thinking, man, he ate locusts, and so I remember looking at the the list, and of course it's people say, well, this is kosher. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm mixing it with some old Ozzy Osbourne in my head from way back when, but didn't Nehemiah Gordon eat a grasshopper on a video or something one time, or a locust, to prove that it was kosher. Or so. Anyway, maybe I dreamed that. So if Nehemiah, I know, maybe, let's see, who is it that, Eric, maybe you can research that. And okay, Clody
Well,
says he did.
chocolate covered grasshoppers are available.
Yeah, yeah,
And you can have all you want.
that's right. Okay, good stuff. Thank you. I appreciate it, Todd. Julia, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, my friend.
Shabbat Shalom. Can you hear me?
I can.
I was going to speak on, I put my hand down because I was going to speak on what Tom said when we're thinking that it's too different. And when I looked at it originally, I thought, hey, this seems to be two different stories and not two different sources with the same story because of the things that happened. But
Yeah.
I think if you take into account that they may not be chronological and that there were two different reasons for the story, they could be the same account. They could be the same account because I also thought, why such punishment when they just got out of Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it's not quite chronological and they didn't just get out of Egypt, then maybe that would be why. The stories kind of seem to focus on two different things. And that may be why they are indeed two different accounts of the same story. That's just my opinion.
Hey,
that it may in fact be.
Yeah, it's certainly debatable, and I get that some would say no, it's not, as as people have. I mean, Tom said as much earlier, but what I find interesting is, and just bear with me to kind of elaborate on what you said, Julia, is you have two accounts of the giving of the Torah, the giving of the 10 words, and two accounts of the second giving of, and two accounts of, and two accounts of, and two accounts of, and you can list them on and on and on. And so what I began to do was to put those in my notes and look for clues. So for instance, it's one thing if you go, well, this might be the same story told twice by different writers or whatever, like I propose, and then you could dismiss it, except that you have the same precursor to the event, the same thing following the event, and it begins to just add up, especially when you consider the timing of things. So we know, for instance, that, like, I almost would assume, if I didn't know better and I didn't read closely, that the Exodus 16 account is an account from early in the wilderness journey. They're just right out of Egypt. They just left. And then the Numbers account must be way later, right? Because you go, well, it's mentioned in Numbers. Well, a lot of people don't realize that if you read the end of Exodus and the beginning of Numbers, you're only dealing with a month. You know, I mean, that's very clear. And then within both of those books, within the Exodus stories and the book, the stories in Numbers, they're not chronological. So again, I find it striking that in Exodus 16, which clearly was written at the earliest, after the children of Israel were already in the land eating from the grain grown from the soil of the land of Canaan, it, like you, I'm at least willing, can we say I'm willing to consider it? And I'm not willing to dismiss that they are the same story, just told differently.
Also, yes, because if you look at Numbers, and one of the things is they mention about the food back in Egypt.
Yeah.
I find it also a little puzzling that if it was two different stories, why they wouldn't say the food back in Egypt and like the meat that God gave us once before.
Yeah.
If there were two different stories to go all the way back there, but not to mention that once before gave meat also kind of gave me pause that it may be two different sources telling the different story, because there are two different points or two different things being emphasized
Yeah.
in Exodus and Numbers. There are just different emphasis.
And
That's all.
yeah, one more point. The best case
Yeah.
scenario, if somebody says, Ross, you're all washed up, I don't buy that at all. Exodus 16 and Numbers 11 are way different. It's just different accounts. It's demonstrating, as Tom said, you know, his point was it could just be to illustrate that they're forgetful. And that certainly is a theme, I'll admit. But if I just go with the dates, and I say let's say I trust the dates at the beginning of Exodus 16. It's in the first year, the second month. If I trust the dates in Numbers 9, which lead into 10 and 11, where we're dealing with, then I'm a year later. So Exodus 16, they get the ground covered with quail. And then they really have forgotten, because in Numbers they get so much that it's coming out their nose. But it's on the heels of the first appearance of manna. So it's interesting. It certainly is interesting. Yeah. And I think that what we have in the Pentateuch is several of these sources, and I'm glad we have them all, that are presented by different sources. The other thing, I have friends who are in what we would call the anti-missionary groups, you know, Rabbi Tovia Singer and others. I mean, he's an acquaintance of mine. I tour Israel with him. And sometimes you get these guys and they bring up stories in the Gospels and they'll say, oh, look how silly this is. They don't even agree. And, you know, these miracles are just fantastical. And, you know, and there's something to what they say. But I wonder what these same people would say if they had to face a critical view of the Pentateuch. And the answer to that is most would not do it. Right. Because what I have found in my current place, it's become very, very obvious to me, even people that I love and respect, if you're a fundamentalist, be you Christian or Jew, you're going to hold fundamentalist views of your text, but you won't do that with others. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So I would say, let's say I'm Jewish and I think Christianity is silly and the Christian Bible lied or stole or borrowed or whatever, I'm going to stand in my glass house and look at the New Testament text and, you know, throw rocks. And they have two stories of the bread and fish in the Gospels, and those are really just corrupted. Well, I think it's interesting that we see this in the Pentateuch as well, is all I'm saying. So, yeah, and they're fantastic.
And the issue with that be that it would still be man's view. If you're going to be fundamentalist and you're going to stand with whichever man you want to, and I'm saying man, but you know, men.
Yeah.
You're standing with that and giving a reason for doing that in the Jewish faith, and you're also doing it in the Christian faith. And so that's sometimes something that you don't see or people are not willing to see. So,
yeah. It's
okay,
hard.
That's all that. Yeah.
Good.
That's all. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thanks, Julie. I appreciate your insights. Miriam Cormier, how are you, Miriam? Shabbat Shalom. I'm watching this. There we go. Let's see if he can come through for us.
Shabbat Shalom.
There you go. Hey, Shabbat Shalom, Miriam. Good to hear your voice.
Hey. I love this study. It has been great today. Thank you, Ross. My question is, and I want to follow up on Tom, where he spoke to earlier about the complaints and the hunger that the slaves, the children, was in the wilderness, you know, no food. My statement is, as a slave, that's something you should have experienced several times before, not just in the wilderness, but as a slave, hunger.
Yeah.
So why have so many complaints so soon? Okay, and that's what I was, wondering. They they weren't so sumptuous and prosperous as a slave. So why complain as a free one?
Yeah, it's a question we all have when we read the text, I think, Miriam. You bring up something very insightful. You wonder, why is it that there's so much complaining? I mean, it starts early and it continues the whole time. So it's one of the biggest themes in the Pentateuch, is this complaining and griping and so forth. So I guess in your question, it's like, well, maybe you would think they would be used to conditions that weren't so good, but what we have to wonder is that one of those. Now I'm going to mess this up probably, but what do they say? You can take the person out of Egypt, but you can't take Egypt out of the person so quickly. It takes a little
Yeah.
while. It reminds me, people who know me know that I love listening to Martin Luther King Jr., and he often would speak of, to get rid of that mentality of servitude, stand up. It's hard for somebody to ride your back when you don't bend over. So it seems that maybe there's some of that, at least conveyed in the narrative, that they've not yet taken off that slave mentality. And we get the evidence in the text where it says that, on several times, that they were just short of spirit, as the Hebrew Bible puts it. They just couldn't quite. Yes, they're out of Egyptian bondage, but they're not yet free. And truly, the Bible presents it. You're no longer a servant to Pharaoh, but this group of people never left servanthood. They just simply changed masters. The people of
Okay.
Israel ultimately just became servants of God. So,
Second question, thank you. Why so many required measurements, even in the wilderness? Everything, you got to measure this and measure that, ephod this and ephod that.
you mean the numbers, like how many omers and homers and things like that? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
I'm with you. And part of it, I admitted and have admitted and continue to admit that I'm just not good at math. So I don't like word problems that deal with math. I like word problems that deal with words. And so, but I've forced myself to look closely when such details appear in the text. And I think that the writer is clearly trying to get across the point that this is big, big, big. It's part of almost the style of writing, the genre of what I refer to as sacred history. Some scholars will argue that this is not history in the sense that we're used to history. A biography today has certain standards of historical accurateness that is demanded to be in that genre, whereas the biblical text, my question is, could it be that sacred history is not quite so demanding? And what they're trying to do is present these big, big numbers that make you go, wow, that is big, but maybe not hold it to such accurate levels. I don't know. I babbled for a minute to try to answer it. I don't know that helps or hurts, but I don't know the story. If the text would have said, sort of what James Brumgard said earlier. Listen, there were so many birds are nesting in the branches and they're everywhere. That would have maybe been convincing. But when you say it was piled 3 foot high for a day's journey either side of the camp, then I begin to go, it just
Yes,
doesn't sound historically accurate to me. But that's me.
yes, yes.
And I know that,
But you
yeah,
would think after leaving Egypt, going into the wilderness, some of this would have fallen away, these requirements of measurements, you know? And that's what I was questioning.
well, it's also hard. Let me add this. It's also hard to convey, for me at least. Different people have different minds. My mind, when I read a text, it's hard for me to envision how much an omer is and how many omers it would take to feed the children of Israel. But a visual aid like Seth put together made that come alive for me. I will never be able to see that text the same way again. And I think that quite
That was
often,
excellent.
I tell you, sometimes when you read it, I've read that text a lot of times. I know you have as well. You talk about an omer per person, and an omer is a tenth of an ephah, and homers and omers, and I've read those things, but until you actually see how much that's actually talking about, I think that we fail to grasp what it is the text is saying. So hopefully, I don't know, to answer your question, I don't know why it gives the numbers as it does, but I certainly think that we ought to take a closer look to try to understand what those numbers are actually saying going forward.
It was something great to think about. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Miriam. It's always good to see you. Shabbat shalom, my sister. Have a wonderful day. Todd and Angel. Yes.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about last week. I think Karen was the one that brought it up. I'm not 100% sure. It started off with how was Aaron able to get out of Egypt to meet Moses?
Uh-huh.
So was it not maybe as ruthless to live there as we might think? So is it possible that, when they were slaves in Egypt or whatever, they still had full access to farmland, to eat whatever they wanted to eat? Because otherwise, why would they say, look, we had fish, we had leeks, we had cucumbers, we had all this stuff to eat and everything, and now you bring us out here to die?
Yeah.
I mean, it just kind of makes you wonder, how bad was it when they were in Egypt?
Yeah. Excellent point. And just because I got excited when you said that, they have discovered, scholars have discovered various letters, ancient letters to, depends on when you date the Exodus, but both before and after traditional dates, where you have evidence of slaves, or a boss, a foreman saying, little Ahmed, I made that name up, so not to be offensive, but somebody missed work today because he had a toothache, and so had to take the kids to school or whatever. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you do see these excuses, these things that are written about slaves in Egypt. So again, to your point, how bad was it? The biblical account is interesting in that regard. What does it say? It does talk about cruel bondage, but at what place along, let's say it's 400 years, where do we place the bondage? That's the trick. How many years of slavery? That's something I would encourage people to go study. So,
yeah, that kind of makes sense, and it kind of makes you wonder too if maybe, Yahuwah knew himself that as time goes on, it's going to really get bad for them. So maybe that's why he got them out of there.
Yeah. Well, again, it's certainly interesting we look at these details this closely and we begin to see, what are these various texts trying to tell us? So good stuff. What else, Todd? You have any other points that?
As in the words of Forrest, that's all I gotta say about that.
That was good. Even a decent accent. That was pretty good.
Okay.
Angel, I'll pray for you. Look, hey, it's always interesting when we can come together and discuss these things. Is there anything else anybody else wants to bring up before we close? Here is a comment. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing. Is it Adia? Is that it? Is that it? Okay.
I go by Adia or
Adia. All right. While I was watching the visualization, I guess I could let you read it for yourself, but you imagine some archaeologists on the dig coming across a massive stratum of pigeon bones. Wouldn't that be something?
Yeah. My brain just goes there, and I'm like, somebody has to have found this stratum already, I just don't know about it. But it's an interesting thought. Like, would the bones be able to survive as a layer, for 3,000 years? I don't know.
Well, it is a good question. You're certainly not the first to ask that question, because some of the critics would say, "Hey, we don't have any evidence of a massive migration from Egypt to the land of Canaan in this period," right? So there are what we call the minimalists who would argue against that. But the question becomes, where would you dig in order to find this? Well, if you look at Exodus 16, you look at Numbers 11, quite possibly we could narrow that down. But also, to make it even more complex to your question, is, do we know for certain? And I think that's the problem, is some of these areas are just kind of tough to find. But one of the arguments that I read in Friedman's book on the Exodus, he was addressing those critics who would dismiss the possibility, as you suggest, that maybe you could find a lot of these bird bones, if you will. And his point was that a Jeep, I don't have it in front of me, but a Jeep, a military vehicle, was discovered in the Sinai desert after I don't know how many years, and it was just totally covered over, like, by meters and meters of sand, like the dirt had been blown in these deserts. So again, as a migratory group, it's not like they were building heavy-duty structures. The best chance we have at any of this is what Karen brought up earlier. Karen Clark says she's looking into Kadesh Barnea. That's going to be our best, if we can find that, because according to some sources, the children of Israel were there like 38 years. So that's what we need to find. And, maybe you could be that archaeologist to help find that. And Karen's already searching it, so you just team up with Karen. But one thing I would advise, Karen, look up, I'll try to remember to do this later, but I think the article is called The Mysterious MB1 People. The Mysterious Middle Bronze is what it stands for. And I think the author is Cohen, Cohen. The idea that this author, who we know from Biblical Tomorrow as an archaeologist, he says something pretty interesting. To the minimalist, he goes, okay, you don't have to believe in the biblical account, but if it's not Israel, there is a group of early Middle Bronze, of a group leaving Egypt, and here is the material that backs that up. So you might be interested in that, because he also happens to be, Karen, a person who's made some good proposals as to where Kadesh Barnea is. So remind me if you don't find it, and I'll see if I can't find it. So, hey, good points, Dr. Tabor. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention this book. You've mentioned it before.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a debate or discussion, let's call it. It's called The Exodus. I'll put a link in the chat right now to the Amazon thing. Hold on. And then I'll tell you about the book.
By the way,
Exodus.
I'm sorry. By the way,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Nadine posted that article on the mysterious MBI people. Go ahead,
Oh,
James.
good.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. So the title is Five Views on the Exodus, Historicity, Chronology, and Theological Implications. You may know these scholars, or some of them. Mark Jansen,
Yep.
Scott Stripling. Remember, Stripling's involved in the lead tablets.
Yep.
James Hoffmeyer, I mentioned earlier, Peter Feynman, Gary Rinsberg, and the great skeptic Ron Hendel, we all know.
Oh, yeah.
If you follow. So what's nice is each one states their position, and then you get responses back and forth. So it's one of those, it'd be like a recorded debate, but it's better than a debate because they wrote the responses and you don't get all the crazy emotions you get in public debates. So I would recommend the book if
Yeah.
you want to dig into things. And like I said, I've got it up on Amazon. I'll pop the link into the description.
Yep. That's a good one. That's right.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I tell you, this is fascinating, and I really appreciate. I'm going to give one kind of a last call, not for alcohol, but a last call for any comments, questions, points going forward. And Tom is back. Tom has taken a few minutes. He now sees everything my way. Go ahead, Tom, and tell him that.
Yeah, you got me on board. No,
I'm just
I just
joking.
wanted to point out Genesis 16:35, right? I think you said that it talks about a land indwelt, right? So, for the sons of Israel, they ate the manna 40 years until they're coming to a land indwelt. It was indwelt with Canaanites. They hadn't taken the land yet. I'm pretty sure that's the way that reads. It's talking about how they were already there. And I just wanted to mention the bdellium, the idea of the manna and what it tasted like. It's, even the word that describes, what was it, different translations. I think it's ayin bait, aleph bait, resh, aleph bait, resh yud mem, right? Abor, this, the concordant translates it sturdy ones. This food from the gods, whatever you want to, God, the food of the gods. I don't know how you want to.
Where are you talking about? Just so I know what.
It's Psalm 78.
Okay.
Psalm 78. And it's also found, that word's also found in Genesis 49:24. And it's used often. The bulls. It's translated different ways. And whatever it was that this manna that they received, that came down from the heavens, whatever exactly it was, I think that's part of the point. They were trying to, what did they compare to? It was kind of like, bdellium, and it tasted like coriander, because it wasn't coriander, and it was something foreign. They didn't know what it was. And they were just trying to express what it tasted like. And I do find the word bdellium itself interesting, how it's only used one other time in the whole of Tanakh, and I'm sure you know this. And it's where in Genesis chapter 2, where, the first river that comes out of Eden, and it goes to the land that is good, right? And it's and there's the land is good. There's the gold and the bdellium and the onyx stone, very interesting words when you see how they're used later.
Yeah.
Especially the onyx stone. So I just thought I just wanted to express that.
No, good stuff. Good, and I appreciate that, Tom. A lot of us study the same way, and you always give good examples where you see a word and you go, okay, well, if I really want to know what this means in that context, I need to see where else does it occur. Maybe that helps me to figure out what the writer is trying to tell me. And so I can very much appreciate that. I do that as well, where I look for Where's the first time it appears? How many times does it appear? How is it translated? Do we know what the word means, or are translators speculating? In the case of bdellium, it's only 2 times. That is extremely rare, as the point is being made as I speak it. But in Hebrew, it's bedulach. Well, what does that mean? I mean, does it really translate to bdellium? And I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right, even in English. Bdell, is it IUM, bdellium?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is in English.
I don't have a clue either.
So what I do? I look it up. Last night I was up here late and reading and trying to figure out what is that. I mean, is it white? Because one says it's the color of bdellium. The NRSV translates that as gum. It's the color of gum resin. What is that? Whereas Exodus says, no, it's white. Both of them say it's like coriander seed. It doesn't say it tastes like coriander seed. It doesn't say it's the shape of coriander seed. We don't know what it means, like coriander seed. What does that mean? So, but I don't know what coriander seed looks like, so I looked that up. The point is, when we study, we leave no stone unturned. We're looking at text. We're looking at every detail that we can, and every tool that we can find that helps us to understand these texts, not just for the sake of gaining knowledge. I think this is where we would probably all agree. The whole point of learning these stories and studying these texts is that hopefully we can learn to live a better life and be kind to one another and live with one another and advance the teachings of these ancient texts where we should, you know.
Manifest the will, manifest the will of the Elohim, right?
Yeah.
On earth.
Amen.
Because even like if you notice like for me anyway, Badolak, I don't know what it means. I don't really care to know exactly what it means. What I find interesting is how it's used.
Yeah.
And what's it pointing? Why is it used that way? What's it pointing me to? Why would the man from Galilee claim to, say that he was the manna, and the idea in Deuteronomy that he humbled them and he used the manna to show them that you don't just live by, by food alone, but by every emanation from every produce from the mouth of Jehovah. It's almost like a bird feeding a young bird, I get that imagery there, so was that manna? Did it, and then when I look at Ezekiel chapter 1, I see the encampment. I believe Ezekiel is using vivid imagery to describe the encampment in the wilderness. You get the face of the lion, the face of the ox, the face of the man, and that's the outer encampment, and then the inner encampment of the Levites, and how they're described as these alive ones, right? The living creatures, right? Why were they alive? Because they were getting this food, this manna. They were eating the manna from provided from the Creator, and if the event at Mount Sinai actually happened, which I fully believe, what is beyond the reach of this? Of this God, if the voice emanated from the fire atop the mount, is it impossible for him to provide manna for the people in the wilderness? Is it impossible for him to rain fire on Egypt? No, I think that's a piece of cake, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes back to, and I'm not a philosopher, but we could get pretty philosophical, like if we said, can God create a rock big enough that God can't pick it up? That's the old, how big do our miracles need to be? How can we think about this? And you mentioned Ezekiel. I want to go back to that. My mind jumped in 2 different places. Where in Ezekiel doesn't mention manna, right? Or do you have a text that says manna?
No, the manna is no. It's just describing. I believe chapter 1 of Ezekiel is describing the encampment in the wilderness.
Oh, I got you. I got you. Okay.
So, and why is he describing them that way as these alive ones in the feminine plural,
Gotcha.
but the
Gotcha.
inner wheel is the feminine singular, which is the Levites because they all have the same face. The face of the lion was to the east, the face of the ox to the west, and they're described as the alive ones. Why? Because they were being fed the manna.
By the way, just because this is fun stuff, and I know you'll look at the description in chapter 1 and write
Compare it. Absolutely.
and compare it to chapter 10 where the faces are different. It's
Why is the
interesting.
face of, the face of the ox becomes the face of a cherub. Well,
Yeah.
I'm fully familiar. Yeah.
All right.
And if you notice the Levitical, the inner wheel seems missing.
All right,
and
look, I got one thing. If I can jump into now this stuff is, you can't tell anybody about this. This is just between those that are watching now, so it's a secret. But there is an interesting thing, and I've told people I don't claim, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Jew, I'm a Bible guy, right? And what is my faith? It's hard. It's complicated. So, but let me just say this. In the Gospel of John, John's Gospel, I remember this because I used to read it all the time. I typed a copy of it. John wants the reader to know that this types and shadows that so many people in fundamental Christianity have embraced, and it's kind of cool stuff. This is talking about Jesus and so forth. That's what got me into this whole thing I'm in now. I mean, I remember reading Luke 24, and he's on the way to Emmaus, and therefore all the things that were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms, So I started, that's what got me here years ago, 35, 40, whatever years ago, looking for all those things. So the Gospel of John says that Moses wrote about me. And if you look, there are only two, bear with me, I know people are going to go, oh, there's more, but just let me do this. There are two that are specifically mentioned where Jesus, Yeshua, Yehoshua, however you prefer, where he says, that's me. One is the serpent in the wilderness, John chapter 3. Everybody knows John 3:16. Nobody knows 3:14, 15. As the Son of Man, as Moses lifted the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted, that all, and so forth. Okay, so as the serpent in the wilderness is lifted. And people have taken this and gone really exciting and got excited and said, hey, the word for Mashiach is the numerical value of 358, and the numerical value of Nakash is 358. And so there's these hidden signs and connections between Jesus and the serpent being lifted up. What I find interesting about that connection, above and beyond others, and I know we may have fundamentalist Christians in here, so don't, if you're not already, if you're still with me, you can handle this. But in this particular text, in the story of the Nakash, in Hezekiah's reform, what ultimately happens with the Nakash, it has a name. It's called Nehushtan, 1 Kings 18, verse 1 through 3, and it had to be destroyed because people ultimately took what gave them life in the wilderness and they worshiped.
Yeah.
It was something God did for them on their behalf and brought life to them, and they turned it into something, they turned it into an idol. I would say, thus have people done with Yeshua. The second thing that has happened, interestingly enough, is the idea of the bread. Now, bear with me. This is just a thought that I have. Is it right? Does it hold up? It's interesting, just as the serpent is interesting to me. What happens with the bread, which is the other of the two that he says that's me, is that it did, according to the text in the Torah, the prophets, the writings, the Deuterocanonical books, the New Testament, the Quran, the rabbinic literature, it sustained the children of Israel when they were in the wilderness. It fed them. It was a miraculous food. It gave them life. And ultimately, the people grew to disdain that bread.
And that's mentioned
They
before.
let me
Okay,
one
sorry.
second. They ultimately they grew to loathe the bread. They don't want the bread anymore, and the two are connected very closely in the text in Numbers 21. So you get this idea that the two things that the Gospel of John, the writer of the Gospel of John, wants us to put in Jesus's words, that these two things are mine. Number one, it's something that ultimately, could he be saying, this was something which brought you life and you turned it into an idol? And secondly, could it be predicting what we see in our day, that many people have thrown the proverbial baby out with the bathwater and said, this is what I think, that I loathe this bread from heaven. I don't know, just a thought. It's bizarre. I usually don't go there, but I do find it striking that those two comparisons, if you follow them out, that's kind of what you get.
But those connections are there. And it's when they say that he brings the serpents in the wilderness, right? It's when they say that about we loathe this bread. We're sick of this bread already.
Well, also they say, who is God among us or not? And that doesn't go very well. Yeah.
And I fully agree. You don't worship the creation, worship the creator.
Well, it's
and Jesus ate the creation.
Yeah.
The creator.
Good stuff. Todd and Angel, back.
I'm out.
I'll back you up on that, Ross. The whole thing about with the snake and the connection of the church worships Yeshua, not the Father. It kind of made an idol out of it when that's not what he said to do. And it's interesting that, because we see this all the time when we're watching stuff on YouTube and everything, of course we heard at churches and everything else too, where they say, well, he's God because he tells them, I am. It's like, but you're missing the point where, especially in John, he's reminding them constantly that the Father speaks through me. Because he says I am is not him saying I am, it's the Father through him saying I am. But the church ignores that.
Yeah.
From what we've seen. And so I'm backing you up on that. That's he was who he was.
Well,
I'm not denying any of that, but to put him on the pedestal and make a church out of him is not what he said to do.
Well, I was just going to say, I certainly, mainly because I find interest in the quest for the historical Jesus. I had put the New Testament on a shelf, and as far as my faith goes, I could still say that's the case. But I'm fascinated. It's part of who I am. I grew up in the church, and because of those traditions, I know the text. I think about them often. I wonder, when people, I never got mad. Like some of my friends got really mad. They felt like, I was lied to, and Christianity is fake, and the New Testament's wrong, and, I'm going to throw that out, and thank God, I've given classes where I say, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free. And now I have the Hebrew Bible, and it's the holy, inspired, inerrant, authoritative Word of God. There is no errors. In fact, as Drosnin said, it is. So, but on the other side of that now, where I've lost that need to say that every jot and every tittle is in any wise perfect. I don't have to say that now, because I know that thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint and on and on and on and on, we have all of these ancient texts, all, which are older than the Masoretic text. When I threw all the stuff out, it was on the idea that I now had the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. So now that I know that we've got textual questions and opportunities and challenges with the Hebrew Bible as well, it's easier for me to talk to my Christian friends and say, let's entertain some of those questions again, because where a lot of the people that I know would say, well, the New Testament, we don't even know if Jesus existed. Well, guess what? The same criticism can be leveled against all of the characters in the Hebrew Bible, see? So what I say is take a deep breath. Let's look at some of these things and let's really discuss. Let's be honest to Moses. You know, the expression honest to Jesus. I've always said be honest to Moses. And by the way, one other point. Years ago, I read a book. I think the guy's name, I want to say his first name is Robert, but he's a scholar. His last name is Funk, F-U-N-K. And his book was called Honest to Jesus. And this is probably in the 90s I read this book. But his book was about what was called the Jesus Seminar, where scholars looked at the words of Jesus, attributed to Jesus, and they said, they rated it. You know, do we think this is really, can it be traced back to a real Jesus? Or is this later, was it added by a monk, you know, somewhere in a monastery, or where, you know, vote on it. Yeah, I don't remember the color scheme, but there was one that meant, yes, he said this, I'd bet my life on it. And then you go all the way down to, there's no chance in the world that he said this. I often think about, I do that when I read now in the Hebrew Bible. I know that some people find that scary or offensive or whatever, but I want to look at these texts and say, do we think that Moses wrote this or not? Well, he didn't write about his own death. You know the list. You can start crossing off some of those things. So anyway, I think it's important that we're honest in our historical quest. So to my point earlier where I said someone who denounces the New Testament as fake and bad and, you know, and let me show you all the problems in the New Testament while standing, holding the Hebrew Bible as the perfect, no problems with, I think that's not being honest. I think we have to look at both, and we have to treat those things with fairness. And I have a lot of respect for people who are just like me, who are searching with the intent to truly find the truth. I think, wasn't it Paul that said, seek out your salvation with fear and trembling? Be afraid, be very, very afraid. No, but it's fun. It's exciting, though, I think.
Yeah, it is. And that's one of the, you know, not only with the Tanakh, but as far as with the New Testament as well, that's one of the things that we're kind of in a walk on ourselves is who really was Yeshua? I mean, who was he really? Compared to what the church teaches, who was he? And of course, one of the things that we did, like you said, like you put the New Testament on the shelf because you seem to really click with the Old Testament better.
Yeah.
And I can appreciate that. And one of the things that we did to really learn who he was, and I'm sure this is going to cause an explosion on here, but one of the things we did is we took Paul and went, kicked him to the curb.
Yeah.
Because that's the whole problem right there. That is the church. So if we take him out, and we studied him line by line, and we found everything to be against what was being taught by Yeshua. And so the Torah. And the Torah.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you do that, it kind of opens up a whole new world because it's like, well, if you read what James, and Peter, and John, and Jude, and all them said, who was actually with him, it kind of makes more sense, and you start to realize the stuff they're warning about in there is the guy you just put on the shelf.
Yeah.
So that's the wolves in sheep's clothing, because if you take that out, then you understand that Yeshua was Torah, and it brings you back to that. And that's what happened with us. And it's like, man, it's been an amazing walk ever since. I mean, it really has. And we've learned so much more about both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, I'm not saying for everybody to do it. It's a huge, I understand it's a huge deal because everybody is, you know, the Bible, here's the word right here.
Yeah.
You know, only put together by man. So
You know
Yeah.
what? I tell you, every week I'm really amazed. Look at this group and listen to this group. It's such an interesting assembly of people. A lot of us, I think, in a lot of ways, come from very similar backgrounds. So in some ways, I guess you could back up and go, "Well, are you really that different?" And maybe not. Maybe we are similar in a lot of ways, and we have different views on certain things. But the fact that we can come together and discuss these tough questions, theology questions, and be okay with it. Like I may not agree with everything everyone says, and you certainly don't have to agree with everything I say. But the fact that we can have this conversation is, I think, one of the highlights of what this world needs. It's come to the table and discuss. So good
It
stuff.
is awesome. We definitely look forward to it every week. So just to hear what everybody has to say, and it kind of, Tom just said something a little while ago that made us both go, "Oh!"
Yep.
And but it wasn't really what he was saying. It's just that what came to our heads.
Yep.
We're kind of like, "Okay, yeah."
Yep.
So so it's really interesting. We really do look forward to this every week.
Good stuff. No, and I'm glad you're here and part of it, and you say things that make me go the same way. So good stuff. No, good stuff. All right. Thank you. Carolyn, how are you, my sister? Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Ross. Thank you. When you read the Minor Prophets, and I can't remember where the verse is, but God says that He will be our only teacher. And I think that this group is responding to a worldwide, a zeitgeist that is sweeping the world, stirring up people's spirits. We have the chance prior to when He will be our only teacher, we have the chance to respond and learn from Him now.
Mm-hmm.
By being, as Todd and Angel say, throw Paul out. I'm to that point. I don't like Luke, because Luke in the gospel talks about how Christ was tiptoeing through the streets, carrying his cross, talking to the daughters of Jerusalem. The daughters of Jerusalem are the name of the chorus in the Song of Solomon. It is a theatrical performance group, the Daughters of Jerusalem. No way would Christ, having had to have someone else help him carry his cross because they had beaten him to within an inch of his life, be talking like Luke has him talk to the daughters of Jerusalem as if he was out for a Sunday walk. This miraculous stuff going on in the first part of Acts, if that was happening in Jerusalem, the Romans would have been down on those people like stink on you know what. There would have been no way that that could have occurred. It's not talked about in any other sources other than Luke and Acts. So we need to really question what we're reading on the page. If it sounds too miraculous to really be, and if you can't back it up with historical references, and they were able to read and write at that time, and people were writing about what was going on, that would have been noted. Matthew's talking about the babies being killed by Herod. There's no mention of that either. That's one of those miraculous types of things that we should really question what we're seeing. When we swallow, as a Christian, hook, line, and sinker what comes out of our pulpit and our Sunday school stories and the Christmas pageant and the Easter pageant and all the stuff we teach our kids, we should question what we are, not only what we are teaching, what we were taught. And this group, thank God for this group, our minds are open. We think outside the box. I'm sure we get offended. I'm sure we wish we hadn't been here sometimes because we have to give up so much to stay in this group. Anyway, I ramble, but
I I hear you. I think that you're right. We have to be willing to take a good hard look at these things, and we have to be honest as we do that. I mean, I know that when when you're in the world of challenging long held traditional beliefs, it's uncomfortable to say the least. I've had people tell me, one gentleman who came to the conference here back in April sat across from me and told me, he said, I have been so mad at you. This is a big guy that, I really, I think he was kind of clenching his fists when he was telling me. But he said, I have to get away from you and turn it off, and then I'll come back later and watch. So my intention is not to make big guys want to beat me up. That's certainly not it. But at the same time, I'm not one who will, like, if I see it, I'm going to call it like I see it, as in such a way. In other words, I don't want to stir trouble for the sake of stirring trouble, but I want to bring up things that I believe are true, and I want to be honest. And I don't want somebody to say, well, years from now, somebody say, well, Ross lied to us. As I find things that I think are true, I'm certainly going to bring those forward. So, hey, it's good to have you, though, Carolyn, and your thoughts are always welcome. Todd and Angel.
I'm going to bounce this off what she just was talking about. We learned in the last church we were at, when Luke mentions Theophilus.
Yep.
We were told that in seminary they teach that as student. Well, that's wrong. Theophilus was a person. He was actually Nero's magistrate. I don't know if you're familiar with, I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but Doug from Jesus Words Only on YouTube. He's an actual lawyer, and he produces these videos in a format as if he was in court. So he gives you every proof he's got, everything is laid out there in the videos. And one of the interesting points he makes is that Acts and Luke's gospel was written by Luke as letters to the magistrate in Paul's defense while he was in prison. So while Nero had him in prison, these two letters were written in defense for him. And because if you think about it, Luke pretty much matches everything Mark has.
Yeah.
Almost word for word, paragraph by paragraph. Everything's almost matches him. So it kind of makes you wonder, of course, Mark was supposedly with them. So it could be he got the gospel from Mark. And he wrote that as a letter showing why Paul preaches what he preaches, because here's all this stuff. And it just, if you think about those letters being formats for Paul's defense, it does kind of connect the dots a little bit. And so I'm in the what, kind of like what Carolyn just said. We've been printing off other versions of the Gospels just to kind of get different translations. And one of the things I was telling her the other day is like, well, they just released Luke, and I'm like, I'm really not too concerned about that one. And not because Luke was Paul's buddy or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just that he wasn't there. So I'm not really too concerned about what he thinks about the gospel because he wasn't with them.
Right.
But the other three were. Supposedly Mark was the naked guy that ran out of the garden. I don't know.
Well, one thing that just to kind of pull this into my world where I'm at in terms of religious research, it's the ideas that you're describing where what scholars have long recognized, and many people who are popularly making videos about problems in Christianity have mastered this. It's that most scholars since the 1800s identified that if you took the Gospels side by side, horizontally reading them, Mark, Matthew, Luke, at least the synoptics, maybe not so much John, but John does have some that you can work in horizontally. You can do that with what is called a harmony of the Gospels. it provides insight, and you begin to see that Mark, and most scholars, almost without exceptions, will say that Mark is the earliest source, and that Matthew used some of Mark verbatim, and Luke used some of Mark verbatim. And so, yeah, there you go. That's one example there, gospel parallels. So now that's not my world anymore so much in my research, but what I began to think about several years ago was, hey, I'm reading about the spies in Deuteronomy 1, and I know it's in Numbers 13 and 14. I wonder if I could put those together and read them. And when I did, I was blown away.
Oh, yeah.
My whole world changed, because then I said, hold on a minute. I've got to go through the whole Torah. And I looked, I couldn't find that there, and that still to this day, I don't think there is something like what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a harmony of the sources from the Torah, because what I'm doing is I'm building. It makes me look at, and people might not agree, but if I say, okay, I found a story of the miraculous bread from heaven in Exodus 16. Look, there's another story in Numbers chapter 11. But maybe they're not the same. But wait, there's also the quail. It's in Exodus 16 and Numbers 11. So when you start laying that out, what you begin to see is, just as Mark and Matthew and Luke and John are different sources, so too are what we have in the Hebrew Bible in the Pentateuch. And the fact that those certain sources use certain language and vocabulary that clues us in on that particular voice or that particular hand, I think is astounding. It is truly one of the most remarkable things that I've ever been involved in, is this study.
Yeah, I just got this the other day, so I can get the one you mentioned last week.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read this, because the way he's got it color coded in here is going to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to at least consider, again, you can look at it however you want to. When I teach, I'm not specifically now telling people, because not every scholar believes this, and even if they did, it wouldn't mean I had to, that the documentary hypothesis is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Richard Elliott Friedman is a big advocate for the documentary hypothesis.
Yeah. And he got a sense of humor, too.
He's a good guy. And look, he's at least going to give you the best case for the documentary hypothesis. You may not agree with it. You know, I have other authors I've read who also present pros and cons. What I decided after becoming fairly familiar with the documentary hypothesis, JEPD, and other sources, was to say, whatever they came up with in the 19th century may or may not be accurate. I want to go back to the book and look at the book in its original form as best I can, and see if any of this makes sense. And so that's, but I'm glad you got it. That's a fantastic book, and we'll look at that some as we proceed in some of our classes. So,
because I also wonder too if the Moses scroll is not the original Deuteronomy.
Yeah. It certainly is presented two different ways. One is it is a vest pocket version of Deuteronomy, an abbreviated form. Of course, there's the view that it's a forgery altogether. I mean, until we find it and test it, hey, that's an option on the table. I'm an honest researcher. I just find that it would be certainly uncanny that so many things that were not known in the 19th century turned up on a scroll. I mean, hey, could it be? I don't know. But then,
well, how come you and Jono hadn't found it yet?
Oh man, I tell you, and we've got a good team. I mean, the Tylers and we're working with the Tylers. We're working with the Don James Tabor, and obviously Jono and I. We're. It's not because we're not looking. So, I mean, I want to find it. I want to
somewhere.
I want to test it. And here's the deal: if it turns out somebody goes, "Hey, we tested it. This is from a goat that was born in 1863." All right, you got us. It's not real, but who knows? So,
You never know.
hey, it has really been a great day with you guys. I look forward to seeing everyone Thursday night. Jonah and I will do a live show. We haven't picked a topic yet. We have to do that very soon. And then next Saturday, we'll be back here. So thank you all for your insights, for your patience, for your kindness, for all of that good stuff. And it's fun being with you. So go be with someone else now. And take care. We'll see you next week. God bless you and have a wonderful, beautiful week. Shabbat shalom, Shavua tov.